Thank you. Awesome. Thank you guys very much for being here. If I hadn't just eaten, I would be super jealous of all the food you guys had, but luckily they just fed me, so I'm super good to go. All right, like he said, I am from Baylor. I am in my 3rd year of hopefully only 5, praying on that. I am a PhD candidate and I study breast cancer research, but I will not be here talking to you guys about breast cancer, as the title says. I am talking to you guys about STEM or science communication. And the reason I've chosen to do this is because my focus of my career has shifted quite considerably since I started. When I was an undergrad, I started doing my research, gosh, like 2 months after I started. I really, really thought I wanted to be a researcher forever and ever and ever. And I did. I loved it. And I came to grad school and I still thought that's what I wanted to do. And then I kind of realized I liked talking about my research more than I liked doing it. Not that I still don't love doing the research and spending time in the lab, but I don't see myself being fulfilled by that forever. And so I started exploring this field of science communication. You might also hear me call it SciComm. It's what the cool kids say. So I really got into SciComm, and I've learned so very much, and I've also learned that it can start really at any point in your career, even before you feel like it's even gotten off the ground. So I hope that you guys find something interesting. I convince you that SciComm is important and worth your time, and then I can give you guys some tools to move forward. All right, so like I said, we're going to talk about science communication. Hopefully by the end, you'll be convinced that it's good and you should do it. And then I'll talk to you about how you can get started both physically, which is obviously what I'm doing right now, or online. So when we think about science communication, we usually see it from a problem of deficit versus engagement. So we have these scientists, these STEM researchers that are effectively drowned by the amount of information that they have. We're doing research, we're finding out things that aren't even published in textbooks or online, and we're weighed down by it. But we're all speaking a language that people outside of our fields even don't understand. And so everybody else is left walking around really confused, not getting the best information out there, and not really knowing what's happening in the scientific community. But when we approach people on a one-to-one basis and we talk to them in a language that they can recognize, there becomes this level of engagement, and therefore there becomes a level of understanding and appreciation. And one more comic, because I like comics and because Charlie Brown is cool, kind of to re-emphasize what you think you sound like sometimes when we as scientists talk to you guys. If I start talking to you about my research just point blank, I know all the words that I'm saying, and I think that you guys know all the words that I'm saying, but that's very much not true. I just sound like the teacher in Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah. So if you Google SciComm or science communication, Wikipedia comes up and gives you the super helpful definition that it is not science publishing, scientific communication, or scholarly communication. Well, I disagree with Wikipedia. As much as they might want to hyperlink out their 3 other pages, I think that they all technically could be considered one. All of these things underneath here, I think, qualify as being part of science communication. It can be from everything to talking in person, to chatting online, writing books, articles, or blogs, listening to things on the radio, watching videos, having a website. Really anything that talks about science is considered science communication. So we have some famous SciCommers up here. Does anybody know any of them? Bill Nye, everybody loves a guy, Bill. Neil deGrasse Tyson. It says Frankenstein for those who can't see it. So the author is Mary Shelley. So she's the first author of effectively a sci-fi book. She is the mother of sci-fi, if you will, bringing the ideas of reincarnation into taking science and putting it kind of into these mythical ideas and making them accessible in a really interesting way that has now made Frankenstein one of the top novels ever written. Anybody know who this woman is? I'll give you a hint. She works for NASA. No? Okay. That's Lauren Worley. She is the advertising and marketing director for NASA, and she's incredible at her job. She goes toe-to-toe with some of the top companies and the most argumentative politicians out there, and she convinces them day in and day out that NASA is worth funding, NASA is important, what we're doing at NASA is should be talked about and is worth your money, basically. So she goes out and does things a lot in the physical sphere. Anybody know this guy? Father of science communication. Host of the 1880s show The Cosmos. Quoted, "We are all made of star stuff." Carl Sagan. So Carl Sagan is, like I said, the father of science communication. Neil deGrasse Tyson has been, talking about him forever. They are both astronomists and have backgrounds in kind of astronomy and physics. So they have a really good tie there. Kind of clue on the bottom there, Cara Santa Maria. So I absolutely love Cara Santa Maria. Not only is she whip smart, super sassy, but she has a talk show called Talk Nerdy, and I'm all about puns. So I think she's great. She used to be on a podcast called Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which was mostly men and then Cara. And she decided she didn't like being talked over anymore, and she thought that she had a voice worth saying things on her own. So she started her own podcast, and she has been absolutely dominating the podcast sphere with all of her information. She is actually really interesting because she's a very modern sci-commer, whereas I feel like some of these other people, especially Bill and Neil, they're kind of further along in their careers, whereas Cara's still undergoing her science education. She's currently in school getting her PhD in psychology. It's just taken her a little bit longer because she did her undergrad and then did SciComm and then her master's and then SciComm, and now she's doing them concurrently. How about the guy in the middle? He was on MASH. Anybody knows that show, or anybody's parents watch that show? That's Alan Alda of the Alan Alda Institute. He is an actor, effectively, who believed in science so much that he started this foundation that's only goal was to disseminate information to the public. There's a really cool initiative that they started called the FIRE Initiative, and it's literally taking basically the idea of how would you describe fire to somebody who's never seen a fire, and taking that and expanding it onto your research. How would you explain your research to somebody who has no clue what you're doing? And there's actually a competition that goes around every year, but they had to go through some restructuring, so it's not currently active, but really interesting. And then this guy is Dr. Eric Topol. He is a cardiothoracic surgeon and incredibly active on Twitter, which I think is really interesting. I don't usually see a lot of actual medical doctors out there on the Twitter sphere. He has over 75,000 followers and posts quite recently. I found him looking at a TED Talk from about 2009-ish, and I think now it's really funny because he was talking about how important it is to bring wireless technology into surgery. He was one of the pioneers for that information. And of course now we're all laughing a little bit because of course we're gonna have wireless technology everywhere. It's things from, he basically was describing a Fitbit before we had Fitbit. So you should go back and listen to it because it's actually really informative and he does a great job with his talk, but also it's just kind of funny. Okay, so we have all these sci-commers, scientist communicators, who have this science, and we can effectively put it into one of two places, into the hands of scientists or into the hands of the public, anybody who is not a scientist. So if a science communicator or a scientist wants to talk to other scientists, there's a couple of ways we can do it. Predominantly, it's by publishing. So publishing is the currency of science. It's how we get money. We effectively trade publications for money. We say, okay, I've published 30 papers in the last 10 or 20 years. Give me money, please. And then the funding agencies say, sure. So we have things like Cell Science, Science, Analytical Chemistry, Nature, PLOS ONE, OncoTarget, literally thousands and thousands of articles out there, or journals out there in which people can put their articles. So I'll just give you guys a little bit of idea about how that process works. You have a scientist who has an idea, who then designs an experiment, and then spends months or years doing those experiments, writes it up into a paper, hands it to a journal and says, please publish me. And the journal says, sure, no, or try again after you make these changes. That whole process can take anywhere from the time you submit to the time it actually sees print, about 12 months to a year and a half. Really long, slow process. Now this isn't very helpful to people outside of your immediate field because the journals are usually written very technical language, very jargon heavy. I could not pick up a journal from physics and understand what was going on. I barely can understand what's going on in my breast cancer journals because the field is so big that there's so many different things that I'm still forced to Google a lot. So these are written that way because we're hoping that other scientists can take what knowledge we have presented and use it to make their own research better. Now, ever since the evolution of the internet, we have had all of our journals move into print and online, but we also have two really great forums as scientists. There's one called ResearchGate, and obviously Twitter. So science Twitter is probably one of my favorite places to hang out. It's full of people talking about the problems that they're having in research, the problems that they're having in their science communities, successes that they've had, questions that they have. It's a really great place to get really quick feedback. If you want something a little bit more detailed, ResearchGate is effectively like the LinkedIn or Facebook for scientists. And I found it to be incredibly helpful. So if I'm trying to analyze some proteins and I can't figure out why, like, let's say my antibody isn't working, I can pop over to ResearchGate, write a question, and in a day or two, I'll have researchers from all over the world giving me tips and advice for how to kind of fix that, troubleshoot, which is something we've never had before as scientists. It's really amazing that the scientists are able to communicate with each other kind of in this real-time, real-time mid-experiment step, because we've never really been able to do that before. When we talk about the community or the public, they also have journals. They have things like Scientific American or Scholastica for kids. There are really great journals out there that publish articles that basically translate this work into something that a non-scientist could read. But again, that's kind of slow, it's a little burdensome. Those are only available every so often. So how else do we communicate with the public? Tons of different ways. So the public obviously thrives on social media. So if you go to YouTube, you will find amazing videos on everything from how to remove the shell of an egg so you just have the membrane, and you can learn about how to change tonicity, which is something I do with my students. Or you can learn about how to build a robot that doesn't work, and you can get a laugh from that. There's Science Instagram, which is amazing. It allows you into the midpoint of science. It shows you experiments that are being done or what labs look like. Really humorous things kind of all over the place, really visual, it's beautiful. Obviously there's the Twitter sphere again. And then there's outreach, which is kind of what I'm doing for you guys now. Talking to people in the community, sharing what you're doing in your lab. And then there's the face-to-face communications that you have one-on-one with people. So the public has all of these ways of getting information. It should totally be easy, and they should be 100% on board with everything we do, right? Well, it's not really the way it works. So scientists have to kind of go through some channels in order to disseminate information to the public, because the channels that we have aren't really publicly minded. So if we take the science news cycle, for example, we have research is happening, it's conducted, we write it all up, and we tell our universities that we're doing research in. And the university says, yep, that's really, really cool. I'm going to tell some people about it. So they write a press release. Local news reporters are going to pick up on that. They're going to be like, ooh, that is really cool. And they're going to write about it and tell people in their communities. And so they're going to publish on the internet. They're going to talk about it on their local news channels. They're going to write about it in their local newspapers or magazines. Then we'll see some more major newspapers. So maybe, statewide or even, national level. Newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post will come pick it up, or CNN, Fox News. And then local newspapers will then again be like, oh my gosh, look at New York Times wrote about this research and this happened here in our own local community. And after kind of all of this happens, then researchers will have about been publishing in that journal article. And I really was interested in this because I thought that this stuff had to happen first. It doesn't always. Sometimes the research isn't published until after the fact of people talking about it, just because it takes so long, and B, sometimes we want to get public support because it sometimes can help the publications process go a little bit faster. So there's at least 3 or 4 steps in this process in which the public will be hearing about science, right? So obviously people are hearing about science all the time because it's everywhere. Well, obviously not. So we have this very tiny little graph. And basically on the left, it says people who get science news at least a few times a week. And on the right, we have people who get science news because they're looking for it. So it's either because it's happening for them or because they're actively looking out for it. And we have people, about 30% on either side. The overlap of people who are actively looking for science and finding it multiple times a week is only about 17%. 17% of Americans are actively looking for and finding science. These are our active science consumers. That is an abysmally low number. Why is that? Part of the reason is because of the types of news that people are receiving. So again, sorry for the small graph. We have news outlets that cover a range of specs. So these, think about like Fox News, right? So they're talking about everything from science to sports to pop culture to what's happening in wars to what's happening in big states to elections. They have a lot to talk about because it's things that the entire nation needs to know about. Of that, part of that is science, and only about 54% of people say that they get their science news that way. So despite the fact that there's this huge big hub, only 54% of people are acknowledging that science is getting to them that way. And of that 54%, 28% of them believe that that's a credible piece of news information. So these people are hearing news. About half of Americans are hearing science news, but they don't believe that these news anchors are doing a good job of reporting it, which is really a big problem. So, like I said, about 54 and 28% of people don't believe the news outlets. And there could be a plethora of reasons for that. It could be because news outlets don't really bring in super credible experts. I can't tell you the last time I saw someone with a PhD on Fox News or on CNN or on NBC, because the information that they're putting out is kind of jumping the gun. So like I said, it's usually coming out before publication. So people will publish it online and then the paper will never get published because a peer reviewer is like, oh, actually you're missing this big piece of data. You have to go back and now it contradicts the results. So sometimes the scientific process can be messy like that, and people don't believe that the big news companies are doing a good job because they're jumping the gun. In fact, I think it's 48% of people say that they don't believe news reports specifically because of the reason that sometimes science gets overturned, and so they don't believe anything that they say, that big news reporters say anymore. It also could be because of the people who are talking about the reports. So not necessarily the news anchors, but the people who take the information from the news and then disseminate it. So for example, we have this lovely scientist who's like, yeah, I learned something. And then somebody who's taking that information, spinning it to whatever political motivations they may have and using it not for good necessarily, or to say a message that the scientist wasn't really intending. And so that reduces the credibility of that fact as well. What happens if people look for science or experience science in ways that are not kind of this big, colossal news source? If we go into museums, science centers, documentaries, has anybody seen Blackfish on Netflix? Good. Like, y'all need to go watch it. It's a really good film. You may cry. Science magazines like that Scientific American that I told you about, advocacy organizations, a whole variety of very specific places that their job is to disseminate science, doing anything other than that. Now look at these numbers. They're really small. We have everywhere from 45% to 6%. I think that the 45% is mostly due to platforms like Netflix or Hulu distributing a lot of these documentaries, and also people like watching videos. But really, their numbers are really small. There's not a lot of not high percentage of people looking for really credible sources. They're just kind of taking what they can get, but huge percentages. So like of this scientific magazine, of the 25% of people who might be reading a science magazine, almost half of them, which is double the amount from the big news outlets, almost half of people believe what they're reading, just point blank. They think it's a credible source. So by going into these really specialty sources, and by having people whose job is to do and communicate science, we're increasing the percentage of credibility that we have. So all of this being said, the way people are communicating science, the places in which people are getting science, why is it important that scientists and the future scientists of the world are doing SciComm? So predominantly, when we talk about science, the more we talk about science, the more people are going to be likely to even just think science is a good idea. We're going to have general support. It informs decision making. So a big example, especially on the ethical side, is a long time ago, well before I was ever a baby scientist, a lot of people did studies in mice. We still do studies in mice, but now in order to do studies in mice, we have to go through the IRA or IRAA, and fill out like a 30-page document that says everything we're going to do, why we need the number of mice that we need. We have to justify every single mouse. We have to say how we're going to do treatments on them, how we're going to study them, all of these steps that take care of the ethics that was really never questioned before. Scientists were just like, it's a mouse. Who really cares? There's mice everywhere. But people were like, nope, that's an animal life. You need to think about how you're doing research better. And science said, yeah, you know what? Okay, you're right. That super valid point. And a big committee was made because of that. So challenging the information, getting our information challenged is a really good thing. Again, it increases funding. If people believe in science, they are more likely to give us money, which we need because science is super expensive. It helps with progressive regulations, so it allows better laws, like I said, like with the ethics laws, to take place so that we can move more easily through governmental transactions. And we also get more trained scientists. So if I talk to you guys about being a scientist, and I convince you that being a scientist is super cool, maybe you'll want to be a scientist. So then you'll go in, you'll go to school, you'll get trained, and then you'll become a scientist. And now we have a ton more people in the world that know how to do science, and that's only going to be better because at that point we can compete with other groups. So not only are universities competing with each other, but we can think about it nationally, right? The US is probably one of the top countries in terms of scientific output, and it's because we bring in a lot of people and we spit out a lot of people. But we could do so much better. We could have so many more scientists, and that allows us to expand the kind of research that we're doing. It promotes understanding about the scientific process. So one of the big examples is a paper that just came out about mitochondrial DNA. So do you guys know that your mitochondria has its own DNA? Cool. Do you know if mom or dad gives you that DNA? Well, a paper just came out that's published on the fact that dads are actually contributing also to mitochondrial DNA. So we had this phenomenon for years and years, right? That people just believed, like, they wrote Mother's Day cards about, thanks mom for my mitochondrial DNA. You can't do that anymore. You gotta thank mom and dad now, and then it just ruins the point. So it really makes an understanding that science wasn't bad. It was just not perfect, and that's sometimes how it goes, is we learn more, our technology improves, and we can make better science. And also because people want to hear about it. Another graph from the Pew report. So we have all these different kinds. We have local community news, politics, science, business, sports, and entertainment. I was floored by this statistic. 71% of people want to hear about science news. That's more than sports news. We have entire channels devoted to sports. Nobody wants to hear about sports. I mean, some people want to hear about sports, but really, nobody wants to hear about sports. People want to hear about science. So let's give the people what they want. More reasons for SciComm. We're controlling the message. So somebody reads an article online and then posts it to their friend, and their friend rewrites it and shows their grandma, and then grandma gets it wrong and tells all her friends. There's a lot of places that this whole thing could go wrong, even from the very get-go. If somebody reads your article and they don't really understand what happened, and then they write a report and it's not really all that correct, your science that you spent months, years working on is now wrong. People don't understand it. So by you taking the step as a scientist to put your own information out there, you're controlling the message. You're ensuring that the correct information is getting out there. More importantly, that there is a message. So let's say every science communicator fell off the face of the planet today. Nobody's going to talk about science except for the scientists. So we really have to take a responsibility in ensuring that there is still a message going out and that people don't lose interest. It also ensures that there's a future. So like I said, we're bringing in scientists and ensuring that our field continues to grow. It ensures that there's funding, and it ensures that the laws that are getting made are correct and allowing us to continue. It also reduces skepticism. So I'm a huge fan of skepticism. In fact, I was telling you about that podcast, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Super great. Those people do so much research on what they are being skeptics about. It's unreal. And then they decide, okay, here's where the problem is. Devil's advocates do nobody any good when you're just poking holes in someone's work and you have no idea what you're talking about. So by talking about science, we allow people to question our work but do it in an academically intelligent way. It also bridges gaps. So by working on your scientific communication, it effectively broadens your entire communicative skill range. So you can talk to more people from social, educational, economic, and cultural backgrounds different than yours. So you can have a better understanding of the message that they need to hear because you've been practicing talking to a wide, diverse audience. You can talk to other scientists better. So I think earlier this semester, Eva came in and talked to you guys. She's a physicist. I can't talk to Eva about physics on the level that Eva wants to talk about physics because I don't do physics. Same, Eva doesn't understand anything about breast cancer, but because both of us spend a lot of time working on our science communication, we can meet in the middle and we can have this really awesome conversation where we talk about the physics of breast cancer. And we can also talk about it within families, right? So a lot of scientists, especially grad students, I mean, I spend, like 70 to 80 hours a week in my lab doing my work. That's a huge chunk of my life that my family doesn't know about if I can't talk to them about it. So it's really important that you communicate your work in a way that people can understand to the people that you love. Plus, it's fun. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you guys at least a little bit that science communication is worth the time that it takes to do. Yes? Yeah. All right, so how do you actually start doing it? Well, let's start with the physical space. So I know that you guys poster, so the people who get to go out over the summer and do research, there's the poster session. That's awesome. That is a great way to physically share your science and talk to a bunch of people. And then there's outreach, which is effectively what I'm doing right now, is I'm talking about why science is important. Eva talked about her science and why her science was important specifically. And all of that is really important, and I'll tell you why. So let's first talk about this group that's been kind of like coming in and harassing you guys the last year and a half. So we are Present Your PhD. Do not need a PhD. Master's students are welcome. And we are a group comprised of a bunch of graduate students. So this is some of us. Our numbers have more than doubled since this photo was taken like at the beginning of this year, so it's amazing. We are a bunch of graduate students spanning over 6 departments. So we have physics, we have biology, chemistry, biochemistry, psychology, neuropsychology, math, business. Gosh, if you name it, pretty much we work with them. And we're really passionate about talking about our science. We think what we're doing, or our work that we're doing, is really important and that people should know about it. And the way in which we do that is by talking to our communities, because we want our communities to know what we're doing. We want them to know about the amazing research being done at Baylor. Some really cutting edge stuff is done here and people don't know about it. So we saw a problem, and this is how we got started. We see there's this ivory tower, if you guys ever heard of the ivory tower phenomenon. It's this big structure that's seen as very elite, like the kings and queens live in the ivory tower. And that's where research is perceived to be, in this really inaccessible, high up place. And then we have the Waco population that scientists sometimes see as so far away that they can't even access them, or the temple population. Well, PYPhD wasn't cool with that. We said, that's really silly. Why do we have this huge institution in our community that's not part of our community? So we fixed that. We brought the research to the people, and we did it in a way that was spoken in a language that they could understand, and we have had amazing support. In fact, in our first year and a half, y'all, we've talked to over 2,000 people, and every single one of those interactions has been incredibly supportive. We've heard a lot of wows, we've heard a lot of I want to be a scientist when I grow up, especially from the younger students, which is so fulfilling. We've talked about things like diseases that mosquitoes carry, and we've convinced parents to have better measures against diseases, and we've talked to them about vaccines and all these really amazing things simply because we're willing to meet the people where they're at. So how do we do it? Like I said, we go out into the public and we talk to everybody from our littles, which are about 6 years old. Those are our kindergartners. They're a ton of fun. All the way up in age to you guys. I don't know if anybody was here for Danny Crane's talk. She did whale earwax and how she can predict pregnancies. But we talk to all of these different age ranges, and we get them involved in science. So I want to share with you guys a 2-minute video on how we do it.
Ask a question. Ask a question. Make a guess. Make a guess. Make a plan. Make a plan. and then let it go. Okay? So, first we have to make a guess. Let's see hands. Who thinks they know what's going to happen? Okay, what do you think is going to happen?
Get bigger.
Yeah, the balloon will get bigger? Yes. What do you think? Oh, it's going to float up maybe? Yes. How about you?
I think it's going to float.
Okay, you think it might fall down?
Yeah.
Okay.
And pop.
Oh, somebody said pop? What do you think?
I think it might fly over the room.
Oh, it might fly all around the room.
Yeah.
What do you
That's what
think?
I was going to say.
Fly around the room. Okay. So we have a good guess. So now we have to make a plan. So my balloon is like this. What's the first thing I need to do?
Blow it up.
I need to blow it up. Okay. So once I've blown it up, what's the next step?
Let it go.
I have to let it go. Okay. And then there's one more step, and it's for my safety. I'm going to put my goggles on, and then I'm going to duck my head when I let it go, okay? Because one of our guesses was that it's going to blow around the room, right? So we need to be safe.
And boys and girls, for safety, your pockets are on the seat. Your pockets are on the seat. Stay there.
Do you think this is big enough?
No.
Okay, I'll make it a little bit bigger.
Too big. Too big.
Okay, that looks pretty good to me. All right, so what am I supposed to do next? Okay, you ready? Very good. So our guess was right, wasn't it? We said it was going to blow around the room and that it might go up and it might go down, and we were right. So we did a really good job, and that's what research is. But there's a lot of different ways to do research besides what we just said.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of challenges working with young kids. Obviously, they get really excited, so we have to work with the teacher's usually attention system. So you can see Danny really well using the class, yes, yes. It's really empowering when you get a room of 6-year-olds to start listening to you again after they've gone off on a tangent when you've let the balloon go. But that's how we talk to 6-year-olds, about research. We teach them, you make a plan, you make a guess, and then you're safe about it. And at the end, they're able to really, I think, have a good grasp of research and this idea that they can do research in their own lives. So through the years, we've worked with everybody, like I said, from 6-year-olds to 60-year-olds when we've gone into the community. And we have been so fortunate to work with some really amazing groups. But we've learned a lot. We've learned that the collaborations that we have with these schools, museums, community groups are not a one-way street. We can't just walk in and be like, I have information I'd like to share to you. That's not going to help anybody. We have to understand what they need, what they want, and meet them where they're at. A lot of times these schools don't necessarily have all the equipment that we need, so we need to be flexible. And this really translates to being a good science communicator because it understands your audience, what do they need to hear, how do they need to hear it, and how can you meet them where they're at in order to have your message be heard. On that note, you can't just shove information at people and expect them to change their perception. Example, climate change. You can't have a world-class climate change expert walk in and explain their research and have people's minds be changed. That's been done and it doesn't work. People are still non-believers, which is hilarious. But a big reason that happens is usually because there's some emotional block that people have. There's a lot of fear that's associated with climate change. People don't want to believe it because it means that they have to believe in this really scary thing happening. And so by meeting them emotionally in the middle where they're at allows your message to be heard a lot more easily when you communicate that you understand them and you hear all of their ideas that are kind of associated with that. So really make your message matter to the person or people you're talking about. And a really good way to do that is by telling a story, because who doesn't love a once upon a time, right? Last thing is personality, way more important than knowledge. So if you are somebody who wants to communicate science and you're posting online and you just throw an article up there and you don't say anything about it, you don't do anything about it, people probably aren't going to listen to you. If you have a lecturer who here and does this the entire time and reads off the slides, maybe talks in like a really low monotone voice that puts everybody to bed, nobody's going to want to listen to those people. You have to have a really engaging personality. Hopefully you move around the room. You saw with Danny that she was really engaging with the students. And so by having a personality, whether it's, one that you put on as a science communicator or one that, you just bring out your own personal self, relate yourself to your work or to the messages that you're trying to say, and then the knowledge will follow. So if I, as a science communicator, want to communicate my science to non-scientists, here's the way that I can do it. It says 2 minutes or less, but I'm going to take a couple more minutes than that. So this is the title of my proposed research. Increasing chemosensitivity, microRNA 203 and ophiolin A selectively target triple-negative breast cancer stem-like cells. Who can tell me what that means? Yeah, it's bad. So this is not the way to talk to people. The way I want to talk to people is I take one part of that super wordy title and I identify a key concept. So cancer stem cells. This is something that people probably don't know about, and it's honestly a really big problem. So I've decided as a science communicator that this is going to be my mission to share this information with people. So if I were to ever give a talk on my research, or when I give talks on my research to people who are not in my field, this is the focus of my work. The ways I do this to help engage people, the pieces of the story that I tell. So why do we care about cancer stem cells? Well, one, they are the biggest reason chemotherapy doesn't work. So when people have cancer, a lot of times chemotherapy is part of their treatment plan. If you have a population of cancer stem cells in your tumor, the chemotherapy is not going to work against them. And then we get problem number 2. These are the only cells that can regrow a tumor. If we get rid of every other cell except for these, you're still going to get a tumor. If you get rid of these, you can get rid of a tumor. So let's make an analogy, right? So let's think about how these actually work in the scheme of real life. So y'all maybe have lawns or know what grass looks like. And you know that, so sometimes there's weeds, right, in the grass. So let's pretend that the grass is the entire tumor and the weeds are the cancer stem cells. If you mow the lawn and cut down all the weeds, which is the same as doing surgery on a tumor, it might look nice for a little bit, but then the weeds regrow because they have a really good root system, right? So that didn't work. Now let's say you take some weed spray or weed killer and you go around to your lawn and it takes a little bit of time, so it takes the 5 weeks of chemotherapy or what have you, and you're going around and you kill all the weeds, and sure, maybe it looks like they died, maybe some of them don't come back, but now you've also killed a part of your lawn, you're also putting toxic chemicals into the water table, you're doing a lot of other things that maybe aren't super great. So that's not really the best system either. What you really need is something that only kills those weeds and those weeds alone. So why are they cool? I study the things that selectively target or only kill cancer stem cells. So I think they're personally really cool because in order to find something that does only kill cancer stem cells, I have to understand how these cells work. And on a molecular level, guys, they're fascinating because they don't behave like every other cancer cell. It's a cancer cell. Now we know that cancer cells are already kind of rogue cells. I mean, they're growing tumors and stuff. But these ones are really special because they will spit out a lot of chemotherapies, which other cells won't do. So understanding molecularly how that happens is really interesting. Also, the types of cell death that they experience are different. So has anybody here heard of apoptosis? Some people, yeah. So apoptosis is a type of cell death that the cell itself can turn on or a cancer compound can turn on. Cancer stem cells do not apoptose. They will kind of re-navigate around all of those signals and say bye Felicia to all of them. So how do I study it, right? I have all these things. So I could just potentially just take a bunch of stuff and spray them on cancer cells and be like, did you die? I don't know. Not the best way to do it. So I have a very targeted approach. I use first a type of cell that allows me to make very specific changes. Those are called epithelial cells. And then after I understand how these changes that are mimicking cancer stem cells work compared to the regular cells, I can then take that into actual breast cancer tissue cells. So we have cell lines that have come from people and then been grown on plastic for a really long time. And that's a really good step because that tells me how it's going to work in cancer. And then I take it out of the Petri dish and I put it into mice. So remember with the mice ethics question? Well, I got to write that 30-page document that explained how I was going to be using mice to study cancer. And it's really important that I'm able to do that because mice are a living system. And sometimes the way that drugs are used in the body is not the same way that they're used on a plate, right? They have to go through your liver, or they might be impacted by the chemistry of your body. So by doing it with mice, I'm allowed to have a lot better control. So I'll take the cells off the plate, literally stick them in a mouse, they'll grow a tumor, and I can study them that way. Or even better, I can actually take pieces of human tissue, so a tumor from a person when it's biopsied, and stick that in a mouse directly. So those are cells that have never seen plastic. So I have all of these different ways in which I can study it, and even that story alone sounds kind of interesting, hopefully. All right, so I've given you a little bit of a taste about how I communicate science. I've talked to you about how you can communicate science in a physical space, but all of that kind of takes a minute. You have to, I'm from the Waco area. I drive down all the way here. I come talk to you guys. I spend several hours here, and then I drive all the way back. And don't get me wrong, I love doing that. But not every scientist has time for that. A lot of us are graduate students. We have a lot of things on our plate, and we don't always have time to spend a couple of hours doing that. So what are some ways that you could do online communication? So the best way to start as a science communicator online, if you don't know what you're doing, is to learn from the pros. So I recommend following something like #SciComm on Twitter. It's an amazing tag that people are using to talk about the ways in which they're doing science communication, or they're talking about science that should be communicated. Again, Instagram, Science Insta is super cool. Read some blogs. You can also Google the 50 best scientists on Twitter. Literally just put in like Twitter and scientists, and it's the first one that comes up. I'm amazed by some of the people on that list. I would have no idea that those are people who would be doing Twitter, SciComm. Basically, just be a consumer, right? Be around, immerse yourself in how people are doing it, because then you can be really educated in the next step. You can see how the people who are talking, who the people are that are doing the talking and who they are talking to, and how that influences their message. So are you trying to talk to other scientists? What kind of jargon do you need to do that? What kind of credibility do you need to have that? Are you talking to students? Am I talking to you guys? I'm probably not going to throw around a ton of words that are super heavy without introducing them first. Are you talking to your local community? Do you need to have an elevator pitch in order to quickly get off information because people aren't going to sit around and listen to a 45-minute talk? Or are you talking to potentially a minority group? Are you focusing only on women in STEM? Are you focusing on people of color? Do you need to make any considerations for people who maybe are hard of hearing if you're doing a podcast or a YouTube video? Really being considerate of your audience and taking this into consideration when you make your material will be incredibly helpful to getting people to listen to you. So you know who you want to talk to. How are you going to talk to them? So you can build your own website. Actually not that hard. A lot of free platforms out there. You can write a blog of your own, or you can write for a blog. You can get on social media, and that's the one that I recommend to most people because everybody has at least one social media, or at least knows where to find one. Or you can make your own podcast. Throw a shout out to our podcast that we're starting. If anybody wants to listen to STEM culture on the podcasts, you should do that. By doing this, you build credibility. So when we do our STEM culture podcast, we start off every episode by saying, we are a bunch of STEM graduate students. We are going to talk to you about graduate student life. I don't think anybody's going to deny that we're pretty credible as graduate students talking about what graduate students experience. So for you guys, you might be like, hey, I am somebody who loves science, and I thought that this was really interesting. That's credibility enough. You can also build credibility in the ways in which you conversate with people, either in person or online. So if somebody's responding to your posts, don't just shut them down. Don't tell them that they're wrong. Don't immediately throw more facts at them. Again, meet them where they're at, understand where they're coming from, really open up that dialogue, and you'll become a credible science communicator because you're somebody who's approachable and willing to talk to them. Also, you can get involved with your local SciComm. So once you have a platform and you've started making yourself kind of known out there, you can also join up with some people, write for your local paper. Maybe there's some really interesting research that you heard or did, and you want to share that with your local paper. You can Instagram the science that you're doing. Heck, you guys don't even have to be doing research. You could just be like, I'm in chemistry lab today, and look at this really cool experiment we're doing. Super awesome. People are about it. You can work with a museum and volunteer there. A lot of options. So you can learn from the pros. Now this is a very long list of things. I will throw this up at the end of my talk, but I really want to highlight a couple. So ASAP Science is really amazing. They just did a video that was spoofing Dua Lipa's, whatever her most popular song is, talking about lab safety. And I actually played that for my students, and they all gave me a massive eye roll. But I can tell you, nobody didn't wear pants to lab after that. I also watch from the lab bench, or look at her writing a lot. She's really incredible because she not only talks about the life as a scientist, but how she takes that off the lab bench and makes it accessible to the people. Two Twitterers that I really like are the woman who does robot science. It's at Simone Yurts, which is not how that looks like you should say it, and the physics girl, Diana Cohen. They're both really amazing on YouTube and on Twitter. All right, so let's give you an example. I'm telling you that all about SciComm. Hopefully, I'm doing SciComm myself. So I've identified my audience as both scientists and the general public. So that requires me to have a presence online that straddles that, makes me accessible to both people. So the best way I decided to do that was host a website on Baylor's online website, basically. So it's through Baylor, hosted there. So anybody who's trying to find me as a scientist is going to probably look at where I'm doing my research. They know I'm at Baylor. This is a really good place to start. It's also set up in a way, like it says breast cancer graduate student, budding science communicator. Immediately, all the words you see on there are welcoming and pretty basic. So it's not going to immediately turn anybody away. I don't say I study metastatic breast cancer using Ophiolin A. That's not going to bring anybody in. All right, and then I tell people a little bit about myself. I build my credibility. I explain, hey, I'm a graduate student. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm teaching. This is my background. Please listen to me. I have a contact page that really spans quite a variety of tools. I have LinkedIn for people outside of academia. So if I find people in industry, for example, they're going to go to LinkedIn and find me there. ResearchGate, I have an account, and I want other scientists who are also on the Facebook of Science, ResearchGate, to find me. I'm on Twitter. You can see there, I have a very professional Twitter picture and of me in the lab thumbsing up because science is super cool. But I only talk about science on my Twitter. I try to keep that as my professional website, or my professional social media site. And then I have Google Scholar where you can read about the work that I've done if you want to read it from an academic perspective. So what's the goal? If you Google me, this is what you're going to come up with. I am so freaking happy that this is what you find. It has taken quite a lot of work and a lot of online navigating to get this to be the first things that come up. My Twitter is the very first thing. That's where I do my science communication. That is my outlet of choice. For someone to find me and immediately like, all right, I'm gonna check out our Twitter. Like you're doing exactly what I want you to do. I want you to find me and listen to the science that I think is cool. You're also gonna see my LinkedIn accounts. That's a professional website. ResearchGate, professional website. Yeah, my Facebook, but like, let's be real, Facebook's never going away. It's kind of like a virus. It's still fine. I'm careful about what I post online. And then y'all, it's my personal website. That never shown up on the first page for like months. It took a lot of work and playing with Google's analytics systems to get that to happen. If you have any questions, let me know. I can teach you. And then there's my lab website. So I work for a man named Joseph Tauby. He has a lab website, smart man. And the first one is me. It'll link you to the lab members, which is where I live. And then it links out to his main website. So literally the first hits on that first page, I could not be happier. And this took a lot of work in controlling the message that people see. People who want to work with me, people who want to know if I'm a credible source, people who I might work for in the future, they're going to Google me. It's just how today's society is working. I'm really stoked that this is what they're going to find. So you might be thinking, okay, Keighley, but I'm not a scientist yet. I'm just a student. Well, I'm also a student, and there's a lot of misconceptions that I have to deal with too. So science is too complicated. Well, I don't necessarily believe that. I think that if you take science and you get down to the core, like I did with those cancer stem cells, I pick one that is important, and I talk about it in a way that makes it interesting. There is no such thing as science that is too complicated. If you think it's too complicated, then you don't understand it. Some results are too sensitive to be spoken about. While this may sometimes be true, things are sometimes behind non-disclosure agreements, but there is a way to effectively communicate science. Again, by talking about things in a way that doesn't necessarily share the sensitive stuff, you can still get the bigger message across. Scientists have too much on their plate already. Y'all, you know, I get it. We are students, we have to take classes, I have to teach classes, I have to do research, I have a lot. Like I said, we can go on Twitter. Y'all have any idea how long it takes to write a tweet? Less than a minute. Anybody can do science communication at any point in time. There's really no excuse. Sometimes people will say to me, well, Keighley, it's not your job. Your job as a researcher, your job as a student, your job is not to do this. I disagree completely. Like I said, we have to control the message that is out there, and as a scientist, it is ethically and morally my job to ensure that there is a message being talked about. It's demeaning. Oh gosh, I love it when like older scientists say this to me. We shouldn't talk about science outside of academic journals. Well, that's poppycock. There's no such thing as talking about demeaning science. You know, if you take science and you translate it, you're bringing people into the fold. You're not lessening quality. You're not telling them something that's wrong. You're not inaccurately describing the science. You're just describing it in a way that allows people to understand. All right, so there's this thing, again, I've been running into this lately. It's called the Sagan Effect. It's basically that real scientists are not people who are science communicators. Oh God, if this doesn't just rub me the wrong way. So the idea is that if you spend your time science communicating and not in a lab, you are not a real scientist. Oh gosh, so there's really two ways to be a science communicator, right? So there's someone who does it full time. Now, these people still went to school. Most of them have PhDs. Most of them still do science actively. It's just not maybe their main job. That doesn't mean they're any less of a scientist. They're still communicating science in a scientific way. The other half of science communicators are people like Dr. Eric Topol, who is a cardiothoracic surgeon, like Cara Santa Maria, who is currently in grad school for her PhD in psychology, like me, who is a graduate student, like my boss, who's a PI. There's all these people out here who predominantly do research, and they're still talking about it online. So you really get to decide where do you want to fit in. Early in your careers, you might want to focus more on the bottom, really build yourself up as a scientist. And then if you really are passionate about it, like I am, I'm probably going to move into that top group where that's going to be my primary job and primary source of income. So you'll have that worksheet that I handed out to you about developing a SciComm strategy. As you think about all the information that I shared, I really encourage you to use this SWOT analysis to think about how you want to do SciComm, if you want to do SciComm. Think about who you want to talk to, how you want to talk to them about it. What are the strengths of doing it this way? How are you meeting people where they're at? What are some potential hurdles you're going to experience? What are the kickback? Pre-plan your answers and your approaches to that. And then there's some other questions on there as well. So I really do encourage you to at least spend 5 or 10 minutes thinking through that before you jump on and get going. And with that, that is all I have. Encourage you to reach out to us at Baylor or at Present Your PhD on any of these sources. If you ever want to get a hold of me, you can find me via email or Twitter. I really appreciate you guys giving me your time. Thank you so very much.